Hey everyone, welcome. I'm so glad you're joining me for this explainer today. We are going on a really fascinating, honestly kind of mind-blowing historical detective journey into the early church. We're going to pull back the curtain on this massive, hidden theological war that totally shaped the course of Western history. And the wildest part? The clues to this entire battle are buried deep inside an ancient collection of texts called the Clementine Epistles. So, right off the bat, we have to ask, who was the secret enemy of the church? That's the central mystery we're decoding today. Because when historians actually dig into these ancient Clementine texts, they find this furious, deeply personal attack against a really shadowy figure. But here's the catch. The authors never actually say his name. Not once. They leave us to piece together the clues to unmask someone they saw as a literal threat to everything they stood for.
To figure out how they pulled this off, we've got to talk about what a cryptogram is. In literature, a cryptogram isn't just a fun little puzzle. It's a text actively concealing a hidden meaning. It's a tool used to attack a figure who has become so incredibly powerful, so untouchable, that you simply can't challenge them openly anymore. So what do? You use a literary mask. You invent a character or borrow an old one, and you pour all your real-world critiques into that alias.
Section 1. The Hidden Feud of the Early Church. Let's dive straight into this intense internal clash that completely tore through the early days of the faith.
We often think of the early church as this unified, peaceful movement, but the reality was a lot messier. There was a profound feud between early Jewish Christianity and Pauline Christianity. And that brings us to the core premise of our explainer. The famous historical figure getting absolutely hammered in these texts? It is none other than the Apostle Paul himself. It's wild, right? One of the most famous figures in human history, and his name is completely erased from the very text attacking him.
The authors essentially waged a hidden, coded war against Paul, using three distinct literary methods, or masks. First up, they used the character of Simon Magus. Second, they created a figure they just called the enemy. And finally, they engaged in a fierce ideological dispute over the eternity of the Jewish law. We're going to unpack every single one of these.
Section 2. The Mask of Simon Magus. Let's look at the first major clue to see how this all builds.
Most scholars agree that in many passages of the Clementine texts, the infamous heretic Simon Magus is actually a clever cryptogram for Paul. In the story, Peter gets into these intense debates with Simon. But the arguments Simon makes, they are historically the exact arguments made by Paul. This brilliantly illustrates the heart of the clash, the source of apostolic authority. Simon Magus claims his authority comes from sudden visions and dreams, which perfectly mirrors Paul on the road to Damascus. But Peter, he completely rejects this, arguing that only physical, real-life contact with Jesus counts. I mean, just listen to this quote from the primary source, Homilies 17:19. It is devastatingly personal. Peter says, "If he was revealed to you, how can you teach things contrary to his teaching? If you became an apostle after 1 hour of vision, do not kick me, who was with him face to face." Wow. Peter is essentially arguing that dreams and visions are totally unreliable, maybe even demonic. It's a stinging, direct critique of Paul's sudden conversion. Section 3. Who is the enemy? Now, beyond Simon Magus, there's another fascinating alias in the mix that ties directly into famous New Testament events. In a short text preserved as a preface called the Epistle of Peter to James, Peter explicitly warns everyone about a figure he calls the inimicus homo, literally, the enemy. This enemy is described as a guy working among the Gentiles, preaching a doctrine of lawlessness and nonsense. That is a highly targeted jab at Paul, specifically going after his rejection of the Old Testament law for non-Jewish converts. It gets even juicier. The text actually accuses this enemy of twisting Peter's words to make it look like Peter secretly rejects the law too, but is just too scared to admit it in public. Historically speaking, this is a bitter counter-narrative. It's a direct response to Paul's own account in Galatians 2, where Paul famously describes confronting Peter in Antioch over Jewish customs. This is the defeated faction firing back with their own version of events.
Section 4. Torah versus faith. This brings us down to the absolute root of the entire conflict.
Beyond all the personal attacks and arguments over authority, there was a profound, unbridgeable ideological split over how a person is actually saved. Let's look at the two competing visions. Paul argued that a person is justified by faith and that the Torah was merely a temporary tutor or guide until Christ arrived. But the Clementine epistles, they fiercely insist that the law is absolutely eternal and binding. For them, Christ didn't erase the law, he confirmed it. To the Jewish Christians behind these texts, Christianity was really just a purified Judaism. They believed that maintaining ritual purity, practicing circumcision, and following the moral precepts of the Torah were strictly, absolutely necessary for salvation. The only major Jewish practice they actually tossed out was animal sacrifice in the temple. Everything else, totally required.
You really have to grasp how deep this division went. To the authors of these texts, Paul's teachings weren't just, a slight difference of theological opinion. His anti-law Christianity was perceived as utter heresy and absolute ruin. They truly believed that by stripping away the Torah, Paul was committing a fundamental betrayal of Jesus' original legacy. Section 5. Why write in codes? Which leaves us with a huge question. If they felt this strongly, why go through all the trouble of using literary codes?
Why use aliases like Simon Magus? Why not just attack Paul openly, by name?
Well, it comes down to that harsh historical reality we all know. History is written by the victors. The Syro-Palestinian Jewish-Christian faction, the very people who wrote these texts, simply lost the war for the future direction of the church.
The church expanded massively into the Gentile world, meaning there was only one real victor. Paul's vision won. As the mainline church grew, Paul was elevated to this position of singular, unquestionable authority. His letters became literal scripture. Because of his untouchable status, the Jewish Christian authors who survived simply could not attack him directly anymore. To make sure their protests survived, they had to encode them. They had to speak through the mask.
Which leaves us with this really provocative final thought. Institutions we see as unified, solid monoliths today were almost always forged in the fires of intense, messy conflict. The Clementine epistles give us this incredibly rare glimpse into the losing side of a massive theological battle. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? How much of our history is shaped by defeated voices that were forced to speak in codes? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning, keep exploring, and I'll catch you next time.